Okay. Are you done? Okay. I'm going to ask us to stand and have us read this together. There's a lot of traditions. I know as a child we always stood to hear the reading of the word. And it's also a black cultural, I'm going to be black in heaven and hairless. But let's just stand and read 4 verses together, and we'll begin. He became a human being so that by going through death as a man, he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might also set free those who lived their whole lives a prey to the fear of death. Do not fear anything, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Be assured, I will help you. I will certainly take hold of you with my righteous right hand, a hand of justice, power, of victory, of salvation. This God is love. Those who are living in love are living in God, and God lives through them. By living in God, love has been brought to its full expression in us, so that we may fearlessly face the day of judgment, because all that Jesus now is, so are we in this world. Love never brings fear, for fear is always related to punishment. But love's perfection drives the fear of punishment far from our hearts. Whoever walks constantly afraid of punishment has not reached love's perfection. Our love for others is our grateful response to the love of God first demonstrated to us. You may be seated. I was driving through Carl Jr.'s a couple of years ago, and they were advertising a coupon for Magic Mountain, and the coupon said, "What does fear fear?" And I'm sitting in my car, and I chuckled, and I was born more serious than God, so I don't often just chuckle in my car. But I chuckled, and I thought, I know the answer to that. Fear fears love himself. Let's say that together. Fear fears love himself. That's what fear fears. Well, I want to talk to you about fear tonight. And the other morning, early in the week, I woke up with a little children's song that I guess my unconscious wrote. It sort of sounds a little like Fiddler on the Roof, and so apologies to Oscar Hammerstein? Hammerstein. And so it's probably a mishmash in my brain of various musicals, but it was a little children's song. And so I heard it, I woke up singing it, and I thought, my unconscious wrote this song. So I didn't think too much of it, and then 2-3 days later, I woke up hearing myself singing it again. I thought, well, maybe God's saying something. Are some of you a little dense when God is talking to you? Maybe there's something here. And so I want to teach it to you. It's just very simple. It's, what would you do if you had no fear, had no fear, had no fear? What would you do if you had no fear, had no fear at all? Who would you be if you had no fear, had no fear, had no fear? Who would you be if you had no fear, had no fear at all? Where would you go if you had no fear, had no fear, had no fear? Where would you go if you had no fear, had no fear at all? I'm going to ask you to live and linger with those 3 questions the rest of your life. You know how some messages, they're good for that moment, but then, a week later, you're kind of like, what did I preach on last week? I don't know. That was that memorable. But there are certain questions. I try to wake up every morning and say, Lord, what am I actually afraid of today? And, when we think of fear, we think of agoraphobia or fear of beards, or we think of all sorts of fears. George would know this, but in the DSM, there's just like, I think the last count, they're not all in the DSM, but there's like 1,500 phobias, that you could have. But actually, you could have a phobia about anything. You could have a phobia of phobias. Now, there's one. Actually, I think there is one. Phobia of phobias. Phobia is a Greek word for fear or terror or dread. And so in Scripture, there's 3 basic uses of the word fear. There's the fear of your enemies that God puts upon them, the fear of Isaac. God's always telling the children of Israel, I will put a fear of you. Remember Gideon, knock-kneed Gideon goes down to the camp, and these guys are trying to do dream interpretation. They're like, yeah, I saw this barley loaf, and he came and it just destroyed all our tents. And the other guy goes, oh, that's Gideon. That barley loaf is Gideon. It's our enemies actually know how much power we have in God, more than we do. So there is in Scripture the fear that God puts upon a people about us. There's a genuine fear in God's enemies' hearts of us. And we're fearful because we think we're going to fail, but they're fearful because they know we're going to succeed. So, you have to kind of go, this is interesting. So all through the Old Testament, you have the fear of Israel, of Jacob, of Isaac. You have the fear of enemies trembling at all the stories they're hearing of the incredible stuff God's doing for Israel. And like, oh no, they're getting closer to our land. So there's that fear. There's also the fear of the Lord, which is a beautiful book on this is Joy Dawson's, what's the title, Tracy? Something about the fear of the Lord. It's a great book. And that is the reverence, the awe, the knowing who we are before God that causes us to tremble at his word. It's not, oh, he's horrid. It's that he is so other than us. So we have to understand the fear of the Lord in terms of God is so other. He's so wonderful. He's so, the fastest cure for pride and arrogance is just a vision of God, because immediately, you just shrink down. I remember our son went to Oaks Christian, and everybody drove up to pick up their kids' Lamborghinis and Bentleys and other cars. I don't think Teslas weren't invented. And I had this really old Toyota Corolla I'd gotten from Sherry when Sherry was off doing missions. And the paint was peeling off. It looked leprous, And I could picture myself as I drove from Camarillo to Westlake like a little cartoon character that got tinier and tinier and tinier. And then one day that car had the audacity to brake in the pickup line. And it was melting hot that day, and everybody was jammed. There was one line, and there was no going around or anything. So I fouled up all the Bentleys, But I just remember this cartoon character myself starting out my normal height and getting smaller and smaller and smaller as I got to Oaks Christian. But the fear I'm talking about tonight, biblically, the third kind of fear, not the terror that God puts on your enemies. Not the fear of the Lord, the reverence of the Lord, the wonder of the Lord, the awesomeness of God. I'm not talking about that fear. I am talking about the fear that guards you from your destiny, that dogs of doom that stand at the door of your destiny. I think that's a Chris Valentin phrase. I'm talking about fear that keeps you perpetually from going into what your heart really longs and what God has put within your heart. Because Isaiah 26:8 says, his fame and renown are the desire of our hearts. Someone asked me at Tracy and Bonnie's house recently, what's your vision, Fawn? And I'm like, my vision, the thing I get up in the morning is the glory of the Lord covering the earth as the waters cover the sea. I was just in a conference today, and they were like, don't you want Ventura County? And I'm thinking, no, I don't want Ventura County. I want the world for God, which will take a lot of collaboration, right? No one person is going to take the world for God. But the fear that keeps us from the thing that has been planted in our heart by God, but there's a fear of failure, there's a fear of insignificance, there's a fear of what if I don't do it right? I grew up in very legalistic churches, and I just knew as a little child, I know I'm going to live like perfect before God, and then in my old age, I'm going to commit some terrible sin, and then I'm, don't pass go, don't collect $200, going straight to hell, kind of thing. I grew up with this religious fear of not getting it right, not being impactful enough, not being significant enough. And so I was with a beloved friend today at this creativity conference, and we both have had really challenging childhoods. And I said to my friend, least God wasn't dragged into your horrible childhood dysfunction. Because that's challenging. I'm 63 next month, and I'm still dealing with little childhood, I should go to George for counseling kind of thing, just little childhood things, thinking, gosh, am I not more mature than that now? All these years I've been serving God. I started preaching when I was 12. I've got a long, long history. And yet, fear slithers in. It slithers in, and it keeps us from going forward into the thing God called us to do. So who would you be if you had no fear? What would you do? Now, Sherry is our poster child for this. I can't tell you how happy I am. Our house, we accidentally built like acoustically perfect. We didn't mean to. So if you drop a penny in our house, it sounds like a bomb has gone off. We have these 12-foot ceilings, and so Sherry is upstairs on this little blue old Kmart portable typewriter, writing a book called A Life Well Laughed. And most of you that don't know Sherry, she is hilarious. She's the one person besides Carol Burnett that makes me laugh in the world. She's and my cat makes me laugh. She's hilarious, and she's had country, lived in India, lived in China, lived in Nepal, lived in Thailand. And so she has all these hilarious stories, but she's click, click, clacking, on the third floor. And you can hear it all over the house because, no matter what you do in our house, it's like amplified 10 decibels. And the reason she's doing that is she heard Jamie Winship say, what would you do if you had no fear? And immediately she saw a little old typewriter, sheath of papers. It had ribbon around it, Sherry? No, just finished manuscript, and the title was on it, A Life Well Loved. So 2 days later, Sherry went out and found that typewriter that she saw when Jamie said, what would you do if you had no fear? And how far into it are you, Sherry? Whoa. So I'm so proud of her. But I want to get back to these scriptures, and let me go back to that first one. Take a little bit here. So Jesus became human in order to destroy, not to mute, not to lock up, not to minimize, but destroy. Can we say the word destroy? Destroy the one that had the power of death, the devil, to set free those who live their whole lives a prey to the fear of death. So if you look at the anatomy of fear, let's just all make us in an anatomy class right now, and we're going to do a cadaver slicing of fear. What are we going to see? Fear really is motivated by punishment, by the fear of death. So, one of the things I really appreciated, the last time we had Jamie, we had superintendent of schools, and we had all these different people coming to hear him, civic people, and he was not talking Christianese, he was just talking to them in a secular way. And Tracy and Bonnie have been after me about, let's learn how to do that. But he started out because there were some people from many different spheres. There was education people, and there was city government people, and and some Hollywood people, and he said, what does everybody have in common? You know, you would think, okay, somebody's going to spend 2 days with this man. Where do we start with commonality? Fear, guilt, and shame. We have it in every vocation. We almost come out of the womb with it, in a sense, you know, fear, guilt, and shame. And so what is the operating system of fear? It's punishment. It's fear of bad consequences. It's like, oh my goodness, if I do X, Y is going to happen, and then Z, I'm over. You know, death of a vision, or death of a vocation, or death, if I take this stand, then this is going to happen, and I'm no longer going to have a job, or whatever it is. If I preach a bad sermon, I'm never going to get asked it. It's a fear of consequences that are going to go badly for you. That's how fear operates. But Jesus doesn't mitigate fear by just muting it or handcuffing it. What does this Hebrews 2:15 says? Destroy. Yes, so he doesn't just, and how does he destroy it? He destroys it by saying to us, don't fear, for I am with you. He's the antidote of fear. What does fear fear? Fear fears love himself. Fear fears the presence of God. And so what does God say here? He says, don't fear anything. I'm with you. Don't be afraid. I will strengthen you. Be assured, I will help you. I will certainly take hold of you with my righteous right hand. George, can you come up here for just a second? I just want to illustrate this. When we think God taking hold of us with his righteous right hand, we tend to think of something like this, right? But let me have your right hand. God takes hold of us like this. So even if Dave lets go, George, not Dave, I'm sorry. George lets go, what's happening here? I've still got him.
He's got a pretty good grip, too.
Yeah. You're going to have my fingerprints in your arm. Thanks, George. So God is saying to us, don't be afraid because I'm here. I've got you with my righteous right hand of power, of salvation, of victory. What's the victory? The victory is Satan has been defeated. The author of fear has been defeated, not handcuffed, defeated. He's been defeated. So what would we do if we had no fear? What would we do if we had no fear? God has promised that he is holding us. Love himself is holding us. And so as we go on in 1 John chapter 4, it says that we can live in his love, that we can fearlessly face judgment. Fearlessly. Now, I don't know about you, but anytime a policeman's following me closely, I could be going 30 miles an hour in a 45-mile-an-hour zone, but I'm afraid, like, are my tags right? You know, did I do something wrong? Like the fear of being arrested or ticketed, not arrested, but ticketed, comes over me. And then I think of all the times I did go over the speed limit. Usually not, because I'm usually thinking I drive slower and slower. I was coming down the Canal Grade one time after picking up the students at Oaks, and this voice comes out of nowhere. This James Earl Jones voice of God comes and goes, would the car going slow please speed up? And I look at Joel and I go, what's that? And he goes, that's you, Mom. Drive faster. And I'm like, well, the speed limit's 55. He goes, Mom, the speed limit hasn't been 55 for years, you know. So I was in the middle lane. But, you know, we have this terror. You know, I used to have the terror of snipping off, you know, mattress cover little tags, you know. Or, you know, you're watching a video in the old days, you know. Some of you too young. David, you're probably too young to remember videos.
I was born in 96.
So you know, you flip in a video and it goes FBI warning, you know, and you think they're walking up the steps to your door like, oh no, we're showing this to more people than maybe that license allows, right? You know, people with tender consciences, you know, you just live in fear all the time and then if you've been raised religiously, you're constantly fearing, oh, that attitude wasn't right, this wasn't right. You know, you're living in fear. But God, in the garden, what was Adam's first response after becoming autonomous? and taking of the fruit, what's his first response? I was afraid. I heard you walking. But God is inviting us into flourishing love. He's inviting us to acknowledge, as Tracy eloquently said during communion, to step into him, step into his sacrifice. And on the other side of the cross, there's no punishment. There's no punishment. We're free of punishment, so we are free of fear. We're free of punishment. Yes, David. Let's get you on the mic.
You might already know this, but an acronym for fear is false evidence appearing real.
Yes. Yeah. That's so true. That's so true. And so our fears, most of the time, have you ever noticed they never really happen, and yet they still have currency. They still have our ears, right? But our fears never happen. I remember my mom had given me a little tool, like if your car goes off a bridge and you go down into the ocean depths, you can knock with this thing and it'll get you out. So she had given me that before a trip. And I came home and she's like, "You're home." And I'm like, "Yeah." And she goes, "Oh, I was certain you were going to die in an accident, And so fear can just take over. Fear for yourself, fear for other people, fears about the future. And they really come down to this. Does God love us enough to protect us? Is he holding us with his right hand? Is he in our midst? Is he with us? Now, my biggest fears are like insignificance, not having enough impact, living a small life. I'm easily bored. I'm like, God, what am I doing with my life? Maybe I've got 20 years left and I don't feel like I'm having enough impact, and just take me home now, God. Now's a great time, And I always prayed that last night. But what is it? It's a fear. Fear comes in so many forms. It's not just fear of cats or fear of dogs or fear of beards or phobias of phobias. It's fear that God will not be enough for you. That's the big deal. Am I afraid that God will not be enough for me? Am I afraid God's not all that into me? Am I afraid that God really doesn't see that I've been knocking on the door of his heart my entire life, asking? Every morning my cat, from 5:30 on, sometimes earlier, just sits outside our bedroom door and meows, this pitiful meow. It's not like a meow, it's like meow, But I'm doing the same thing with God, I'm doing this pitiful little thing with God in the morning. Please let me into your heart. Please anoint me. Please do something. Open some doors of influence. Do something, God. Please open the door. So most of the time when I get out of bed to let Kaji in, I'm only doing it out of identification with her. And she's a rag doll, so she just flops at my feet. And I tickle her back with my toes, and I go, "Oh, Kaji, we're the same thing. I was just meowing at God's door this whole time." But now what's the fear? The fear is God's not going to respond. But look at God coming to Zechariah when he goes into the presence of the Lord. Your prayer's been heard. Now, don't you think he's probably given up praying for a child? There's been a lot of time there. I think of Anna. Sometimes I think I'm Anna. Probably getting her arthritic body, an 80-plus-year-old body, out of bed every morning in this cold, cold place, walking into the temple and hoping that one of those babies is the Messiah. But that consistency, just day after day after day. "Where are you going, Anna?" "Oh, I'm going to the temple this morning." "Well, haven't you been 3 times this week?" "Yeah, but I'm going again." But in the back of our head is this idea, what if he never answers? What if he hasn't heard? What if he doesn't know? What if he doesn't know that my entire life I've been longing and yearning for him and pretty much feel like I don't know any more of him than I did when I was 12? Does he know? Does he hear us? Does he hear us? So who would I be if I had no fear? I'd probably be more content with obscurity. Remember Brittany the other night was doing Colossians and just locked eyes with me. Be content with obscurity. I'd probably be a person that was more at rest. I'd probably not try to impress God with my productivity. I can do the work of 3 people. Easy. Easy, I've done it most of my life. I would probably be someone, this is a great Brene Brown sentence, I'd probably be someone that didn't do so many dress rehearsals for disappointment. Now, how many of you do that? Dress rehearsals for disappointment. I'm always trying to backpedal my heart to not have expectations in a moment. Always. It's so funny, at this conference I just went to today, my friend went to one session and then I went to the other, and we both were interested in both sessions. And so I get out and she goes, "How was your session?" And I go, "Oh, I thought it was going to be terrible, but it was terrific." And she goes, "Oh, I had the opposite experience. I thought mine was going to be terrific and it was terrible." Not terrible, but she already knew. She already knew pretty much everything that was being presented. Dress rehearsals for disappointment. If we had no fear, would we always be preparing our hearts for disappointment? Every time I have a lunch date on my calendar with someone I deeply love, I just prepare my heart they're going to cancel at the last second. I just kind of go through life like that. Okay, well, it's very possible there's this happening and her best friend is dying and da-da-da-da, that'll probably be canceled, So how much disappointment do we live with because fear has a place in us? We listen to fear. We give credibility to our fears. Who would we be if we had no fear? What would we do if we had no fear? Now, today there was lots of activations at the conference. They were great. It was a really great conference. I was shocked that Delspree wasn't there. I was like, oh. What would we do if we had no fear? So, Delspree, if you could pass those papers out to everybody, just pass them around. And I really want you to live and linger with these questions. Like, one of the things that's been in my heart for years and years is to do a 4-week creativity school online that would not be creativity in the fine arts or whatever, but it would be a creativity in thinking about global problems and how to solve them. So it would be a creativity of thinking kind of course. And we already do a reconciliation course, but it's kind of a master's level, and it's 9 months to 12 months long, and we have it in French and we have it in English. But this I'd like to be just one little 4-week thing. But what keeps me from doing that? It's like, well, would anybody sign up? Would anybody want to do it? It's just a lot more work. I've written 7 books, and you've all heard they sold relatively well. They sold to the relatives. Joey and I produced a movie that is on Amazon Prime, Mama Shakina. You can watch it for free on Amazon Prime. But we've done tons of creative things that have never really seemed to just take off. We've got tons of things we've done. And albums we've done, and music we've written, and all sorts of things. So the fear of not having an audience can be a fear too to creativity. Like, would anybody sign up? Would they do it? So I'd like you to just take a moment and ask the Lord those 3 questions. And if you're comfortable, share something of them to someone else, and then to pray over each other about that, whatever that is. What would you do if you had no fear? What would you do if you had no fear? Had no fear, had no fear. What would you do if you had no fear? Had no fear at all. And who would you be? And where would you go? Would you go off into some uncharted waters of need, of grief of God's heart? Would you go to some places that might mean being uncomfortable? Would you go places that you thought God could never give you influence in, but then He does? Where would you go? Who would you be? What would you do? So let's just take a couple of minutes on that. And if you're watching by Facebook, jot those down. Who would you be? What would you do? Where would you go? And just ask the Holy Spirit this lifelong. Those are 3 lifelong questions. But I believe the Holy Spirit will speak to you and give you direction, because God is our wonderful counselor, our mighty God, the God who says, "Fear not, I'm with you. Don't be afraid." And I just really counsel you, don't overthink this. Just start writing. Just start writing. So we're going to say goodbye to you on Facebook and just have some family time together discussing this question. But I'd encourage you to bring those questions to the Lord. Who would you be if you had no fear? What would you do? Where would you go?